Our next speaker is David Carroll. David is the Senior Vice President at Parsons Brinckerhoff. He's their market leader for high-speed rail and railroads. He's also the project manager for the joint venture partnership on NEC Future. He's responsible for developing a long-term global strategy for participation in high-speed and other passenger rail and freight rail opportunities, as well as helping to advocate for and advance high-speed rail in the United States. I already said this, sorry. He's the project manager for the NEC Future, a program of the Federal Railroad Administration, working to create a long-term vision for the Washington-Boston Northeast Corridor and to plan for future travel demand. Mr. Carroll joined PB from the Charlotte Area Transit System, where he served as project manager for commuter rail and streetcar projects. Previously, he led implementation of Amtrak's $2.5 billion Northeast Corridor high-speed rail program that included developing and deploying Acela high-speed trains and upgrading Amtrak's Northeast Corridor to permit electrified service at speeds up to 150 miles an hour. Please welcome to NVision 2020, David Carroll. David? There you go, right there. Thank you.
I know Joe said he, in high school or college, did a study of this place. Actually, on New Year's Eve, 1973, I was in a high school band, and we played here as the opening act to a movie by the band The Who. So I played backup to The Who, which is something that I guess everyone can say. The discussion today has been fantastic and relates very much to what we're doing on the Northeast Corridor. You know, the Northeast Corridor from Washington to Boston is about the same length as California. And part of the challenge that we have is there's Amtrak, which everyone knows about, but there are also 8 commuter authorities, 5 different freight railroads, all using the same rail line, all in their own little sphere of operation. And I think the whole premise of this conference and discussion has been about connectivity. And the reality is we have the most heavily traveled and most important rail line in the country, and frankly, it's the connectivity on it, both between branch lines in the main line and along the main line, has a lot to be desired. The rail line itself is in very bad shape, as most of you know, and it's simply not coordinated particularly well amongst its many users. So NEC Future was a program essentially urged by the states, but is being led by the Federal Railroad Administration. And the goal is to create a long-term vision, not a construction plan, not actually even a project plan, but basically what do we want this corridor to look like in between 25 and 50 years from now? How big does it have to be in order to accommodate all that Joe talked about and that many of the speakers this morning talked about in terms of connectivity, encouraging people to live here, and encouraging businesses to be here. In the process, there is an environmental impact statement that is part of this, but the real goal here is to try to have a corridor-wide discussion amongst the users and the people that live and depend on along and depend on the railroad as to what this thing should be. Northeast will experience about 7 to 8 million additional residents by 2040. Already 21% of the whole national GDP is generated on the Northeast Corridor, and it's going to continue to grow. The rail line now can barely accommodate today's level of traffic. So the question is, if population's going to grow so significantly, and in some areas it's growing as much as 30% by 2040, then what do we need to do to the rail line so that everyone isn't forced to go out and get a car in order to go up and down the corridor, and just encouraging congestion at both highways and air. So what is the role that we want as a region for the rail line to play in everyone's future? A couple of key elements of the investment plan is, and this is something that we just went through 11 public hearings, and almost every speaker said, fix what you got first. The railroad was built, some portions of it, over 150 years ago. There are bridges, particularly the 2 tunnels into New York, but a number of bridges in Connecticut, not only along the main line, but right up to Springfield, that were built in the 1800s. The rail line needs to be fixed. There are resiliency issues, there's storm surge issues, there's simply obsolete technology issues. The electrification system, both on the New Haven line, but also along Washington to New York line, is pre-1935. Amtrak has to specially manufacture parts for this because no one else has been using this system for 50 years. Connectivity, though, really is the key. Not just how do we better communicate along the rail line, and what are communities that need better connections by rail along the main line, but also how do you take all of the branch lines, and there are many of them up and down the railroad, and make them a bigger part of this whole connected region. The work's been going on for about 4 years. We'll finish up towards the end of this year. And the product will be an environmental impact statement and a recorded decision by the FRA that shapes what we call the envelope, or the size of the pipe that the Northeast Corridor will be over the next 50 years. So if Connecticut or Delaware or Massachusetts wants to do a project, or the railroads in there, MBTA or SEPTA, want to do a project, it will have to be consistent with and not have any negative impacts on other states trying to use the Northeast Corridor. A good example, many of you know the Peck Bridge in Bridgeport. It was completed in the mid-1990s for well over $200 million. Train speeds over that bridge are 45 miles an hour. Now, there was no platform at that time for discussing on a regional basis, do we really want to have a 45-mile-an-hour bridge in the middle of the nation's only high-speed rail line? The bridge was done, it met Connecticut standards, it met FTA standards, and it's there, and it's not going to be replaced for a long time. We want to make sure that there is dialogue by all the states, all the people, all the railroads that use this rail line in order to ensure that everything we're doing is consistent with the goals and the role that people want for this rail line. Hence, the federal government's oversight of this and their pushing forward of this program. We looked at many different options for the Northeast Corridor through an alternatives development process that took really about 3 years. Basically, every possible alignment, every different mixture of services, service types, infrastructure additions. People gave suggestions during the scoping meeting, go to Albany, go up to Montreal, then go to Boston. All sorts of important, some of them a little crazy, but a lot of interesting ideas, which we have ultimately narrowed down into 3 build alternatives, the long and short of this. One that basically just says, let's take the service we provide today, grow it so that we can accommodate the same level of service in 40 years. More trains, more carrying capacity, but essentially the same type of service and the same proportional quantity of service. If you want to measure it in mode share, today's mode share is X, and in 25 years, 2040, it would continue to be X. Our second approach says, let's try to move people onto the rail line. Let's try to increase its ability to provide more service than is necessary just to keep up with organic growth. And let's try to serve some new markets in the process. And the third vision is really the visionary one, transformational one, we call it Transform, that would not only upgrade the existing rail line, but also bring in what Joe talked about, the 220-mile-an-hour trains. And part of our analysis has been, what does that really mean, and how important is that? How important is trip time in an era when, frankly, a lot of people right now are willing to take the intercity bus because it's got internet on it, and they can use their phone, they can use their computer, and they don't have to drive. So with the millennials, this interest in someone else doing the driving, and in this era of technology where you can be very productive. It used to be you wanted to get from here to there as fast as you can because it was complete downtime. But does the fact that we can be productive in the process change anything? And so that's what we've been studying and trying to better understand. So an alternative in our case is called a Tier 1 NEPA, which is a very high-level programmatic piece of work. So we will look at New Haven, for example, or Stamford, and say how many trains should go through there, how much capacity is needed to accommodate either this organic growth scenario or all the way up to the transform scenario. And we will identify those sort of programmatic things. You need to have 10 trains an hour going through Stamford. What we don't do in this process is figure out how do you actually get 10 trains an hour through there. We can identify all the choke points along the corridor and generally the type of improvements that have to be done, but we're not in there saying, Penn Station, New York, this is exactly where the platform should go and this is how they're laid out and these are the interlockings that connect them. We'll leave that to the next phase when they actually get money for that project so it can best respond to the technology, the capacity needed at that time in any of the markets there. Generally, we're looking at what markets do we want to serve, how much service do those markets need, and ultimately what is the infrastructure required in a broad sense, what is the capacity required, what's the pipe size required in order to get trains there. All of our build alternatives have certain common elements. Again, most important, everyone said, fix the corridor. So before you start going off and building new lines, let's get our own, what we have today, up to a state of good repair. And so every one of the build alternatives improve existing service on the existing rail line. They bring it up to a state of good repair. Mostly what we have looked at is where are the choke points. 2 tunnels under the Hudson River between New Jersey that has 4 tracks and ultimately commuter and intercity lines that have at least 4 tracks on the New York side is a bottleneck. So the number one priority right now, frankly, of just about everyone in the Northeast Corridor is get 4 tunnels under the Hudson River so at least you eliminate that bottleneck. There are bottlenecks across the railroad. In Stamford, you have trains that are turning to go back to New York that have to cross over the main line. Any train crossing over the main line means everything else has to stop. That's a bottleneck. So we identified all of these bottlenecks, and I've identified the type of project for costing purposes, for environmental purposes, needed to fix that. We then also went through growth scenarios to say, all right, if population is this and ridership is that, how many trains are actually required to do that? And to accommodate that level of train traffic, what do we need on the main line or on additional lines in order to accommodate that? All of our build alternatives get compared to a no action. This is a requirement of the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act process. It gives you sort of a baseline. Our challenge has been our baseline is 25 years from now in the year 2040. So essentially our no action takes today's level of service and simply carries it forward. There are 9 trains an hour, 9 trains a day on certain, stopping at certain stations. It assumes in 2040 you still have 9 trains a day stopping. The fact is, just to keep the rail line up to that condition so that it merely exists in 25 years, our estimate is well over $20 to $25 billion to do that. But you get no increase in service and no ability to accommodate this growth that is happening along the corridor. So doing nothing is still very expensive. That's probably epitomizes our time. Alternative 1 absorbs organic growth. It addresses the major choke points along the corridor. A key one in Connecticut are the movable bridges in southeastern Connecticut between Old Saybrook and Stonington. There are 5 movable bridges, a lot of grade crossings actually still there. Every time a train goes over a bridge, it means the bridge is down, the boaters can't get through, and there's a lot of issues. Those issues seem to be less troublesome in Fairfield County, but in southeastern Connecticut, it's a pretty hot issue. So there's a proposal that we included in ours to actually build a bypass between Old Saybrook and Kenyon, Rhode Island, that enables us to run ultimately a lot more trains on that piece of the railroad, avoid some of the storm issues, the resilience issues, and open up, frankly, more slots for commuter trains to go over those bridges than intercity trains. 2 additional Hudson River tunnels, as I mentioned before, is a top priority. All of these gold spots on there are choke points and are serious issues where either trains can't pass one another or they're forced to slow down in order to accommodate the level of traffic. Alternative 2 grows the role of rail. We actually jump up a couple of percentage points in terms of mode share, but the thought is this basically builds out the Northeast Corridor to the biggest extent that it can. South of New York, it's a 4-track railroad, actually a 4-track railroad from Washington all the way to New Haven. At New Haven, we split service. Some remains on the shoreline, going without this bypass between Old Saybrook and Kenyon, but it remains along the shoreline to Boston. And then what we've proposed, at least to explore, is a supplemental line that would enable us to engineer this for very high speed, up to 220 miles an hour, to improve trip time between Boston and New York and also serve the Hartford market in the process and try to benefit from the investments that the state and the federal government are making in the Hartford line. There's been a lot of, I think, support for Alternative 2 in these public hearings. I think there's a lot of concern about how do you actually get from Hartford to Providence, given the experience in the state in terms of trying to provide highway access between those 2 locations and the difficulty that's been. But in any event, it provides great service to the corridor. It does provide a good service up the Hartford line and accommodates almost 4 times as many trains on the rail line as are operating today. Alternative 3, which I know has a special interest here because one of the options goes through Waterbury, would upgrade the existing line, but also to respond to the interest in high-speed rail, actually build a new 2-track facility from Washington all the way to Boston. So it would end up being essentially a 6-track railroad for most parts of the corridor, 4 tracks in some parts of Connecticut. The 2 additional tracks would be designed for up to 220 mile an hour speeds. It would be true high-speed rail, and you'd be able, as Joe mentioned, get from Boston to New York in under 100 minutes, and New York to Washington in under 100 minutes. It was pretty easy kind of identifying how we would do this between Washington and New York, basically because the markets there are linear. You need to hit Baltimore, Wilmington, Philadelphia, parts of New Jersey. North of New York, there were a lot more options because by far the largest market is Boston. And between Boston and New York, there are lots of different markets, and we wanted to explore lots of different ways of achieving that. One of those routes goes through Westchester County and serves Danbury, Waterbury, Hartford, on its way to Providence or Worcester. One of those routes, as Joe mentioned, goes through Long Island, under Long Island Sound to about Westport, then to New Haven and up the Hartford line. I think in our public meetings, everyone has said vision is great, and Alternative 3, yeah, we should really strive to do that. High-speed rail is extremely important. If you read our environmental documents, there are some questions about how much ridership you actually gain by 90 minutes or 100 minutes between, let's say, Boston and New York versus 2-hour service between Boston and New York. It appears we're pretty much saturating the market at 2 hours. We're not gaining that much from the extra investment. On the other hand, build it, and they probably will come. Someone pointed out to me, Japan in 1960 with the first Shinkansen line had no idea what would happen, but Japan today has been totally transformed by the fact that they created this high-speed rail line. So there's been a lot of debate. The price for building Alternative 3 is in the close to $300 billion. Now that's over 50 years, so it can do that. But nonetheless, I think there's a lot of serious discussion going on as to whether we should just preserve that option or whether we should really endorse that option. The Central Connecticut option that does go through this area is important. Just a couple of notes about it. It is not a replacement for, nor does it in any way undermine the goal of expanding and improving New Haven to New York. That is the main line. That is where all the commuters come from. 91% of the trains on the Northeast Corridor are commuter trains. Amtrak operates a very small fraction of the trains that actually operate on this corridor. The goal of all of the alternative three is really to supplement that existing main line, connect branch lines either to the high-speed line or to the existing Northeast Corridor. Certainly this one it does that as well. It would create direct service to Hartford, direct service to New York from Waterbury and Danbury. One of the benefits of this is essentially moving the rail line inland and away from our coastal area. Reports are 50 to 100 years from now, a lot of the coastal areas are in serious trouble from rising sea levels. So it accomplishes a lot of goals. The cost of that is obviously very significant. One of the other elements, which again gets to this whole issue of connectivity, is trying to address the fact that it's not 8 different railroads plus Amtrak operating this corridor. It should be one Northeast Corridor that is operated in an interconnected way. A single fare card so that you don't need 8 different fare cards in your briefcase depending on which commuter rail system you are on the corridor. Timetables so that you can get off a SEPTA train, cross a track and get right on a New Jersey Transit train. Not just it being haphazard because New Jersey happens to have a train now and SEPTA arrives at a different time. So a lot of these type of things, basically the thought from the FRA is if we're going to invest in our rail line, let's make sure it is used absolutely as efficiently as possible. The benefits of all this is one, most important is having a vision for what we want for the rail line and making sure that every investment is working towards completion of that vision. 2 is for employers, for economic development directors, for cities and towns in the Northeast. They know what to expect that this rail line either is delivering, can deliver, or will be delivering in the future, and that's incredibly important. And most important for users, it means great performance. Right now, every day is another experiment on trying to make a rail line that's 150 years old work today. And everyone, all of the towns and the states are putting lots of money into the rail line, but it just is in such bad need of repair that we have great delays and great problems frequently during the course of a year. Opportunities for economic development based on rail has been a real theme here. I would say there's been a lot of focus on the transit. Transit is one piece. Build a rail line and they won't necessarily come. Build a rail line that then has, strong local transit once you're at the station, that has the TOD, that has good land use policies in the towns that support growth is critical. So rail is a very important piece. It's not the only piece. It takes a village, sort of, as they say. So alternative 3 through Danbury obviously would have a pretty, and Waterbury would have a pretty dramatic effect here. But the other alternatives, and even alternative 1 and 2 that improve the rail line, and again, I think this gets to what Joe was saying, improves that backbone would be fabulous for this region as well, for all of Connecticut. The goal right now is significantly more service between New Haven and New York, and significantly better service both in terms of reliability but also in terms of trip time. And alternatives 1 and 2 provide that as well. We have finished our public hearings. We had 2 in Connecticut, 1 in New Haven and 1 in Hartford. The comment period was extended until February 15th, and the FRA is extremely interested in people's comments about the different alternatives and the role of rail. That period closes the 15th. FRA will identify a preferred alternative, alternatives 1, 2, or 3, or a combination thereof, or something different this spring. And then in the fall, they'll complete the environmental impact process. So thank you, and I look forward to questions at the end.
Thank you, David.